My name is Elena Carter, and I'm 28 years old, the forgotten middle child of the Carter family legacy in Charleston, South Carolina. While my brother climbed corporate ladders and my sister graced society pages, I quietly built a healthcare tech company from the ground up, alone in a rented apartment with nothing but a laptop and a restless mind. Underneath their polished silverware and scripted small talk, they never saw me coming. Before I tell you how my family tried to cut me off, just hours before discovering I was worth millions, drop your city in the comments and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if it resonates with you. You'll want to stick around to see what happens when quiet success becomes the loudest form of revenge. It was early evening in late October, and the sky over Charleston had turned the color of wet slate. I stood in front of my full-length mirror, adjusting the sleeves of a simple black dress. Banana Republic, not Chanel, even though I could now afford both. The Carter family's annual dinner wasn't a celebration, it was a ritual, a performance, and I'd learned to dress for invisibility, not attention. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my phone. Not from fear, from the anticipation of what I'd decided. Tonight might be the night I tell them. The IPO was days away, and VitalBridge Health, the platform I built in silence, was valued at $100 million. My name would be on every financial page in the country. If I didn't say it first, someone else would. I glanced down at my screen. 3 missed texts from Maya, my COO, best friend, and the only person besides Aunt Lorraine who truly knew the weight of tonight. Update. Orion Capital called. Something big is brewing. They're finalizing numbers now. Could be massive. Call me before dinner if you can. I stared at those messages longer than I should have. I knew Maya well enough to sense this was more than routine, but I also knew my family. If I showed up late, it would feed the narrative they'd long assigned me. Irresponsible, flaky, unserious. Even now, despite the press coverage they hadn't yet seen, despite the 2 senators I'd had dinner with last week, despite the software used in 70 hospitals nationwide, I still couldn't shake the familiar tightness in my chest when it came to them. It's a wound you don't see from the outside, but it burns quietly when reopened. As I pulled into the Carter estate, the grand southern colonial with its towering columns and perfectly trimmed hedges looked exactly as it had since I was 5 years old. Unchanged, unaffected, unwavering, just like them. My old Honda Civic felt laughably out of place between Thomas's Tesla Model X and Brielle's pearl white Jaguar. But I parked it anyway. I hadn't driven the Porsche in months, not to this house. As I stepped out, I whispered to myself, "You don't need their applause. You built everything without it." The front door swung open before I could knock. It was Margie, the housekeeper who had worked for my parents since I was a teenager. She greeted me with a smile warmer than anything I would receive inside. "Miss Elena," she said softly, "it's good to see you." "You too, Margie." I handed her a bottle of red I'd brought, a $28 Napa Valley vintage, not the $350 Bordeaux in my wine cellar. It was all part of the mask, the version of me they still believed in. "They're all in the sunroom," she said, her voice dipping. "Your brother's sharing news about a promotion." Of course he was. I nodded, steadying myself before walking into the familiar noise of clinking glasses and curated laughter. The performance had begun, and for the first time in my life, I knew I had the power to end it. Most people think growing up in a wealthy family means you've got it made. But sometimes, the biggest mansions have the deepest silences. I was raised in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house so pristine it looked more like a museum than a home. 3 stories, white columns, wrought iron balconies, and not a single space where I ever felt truly seen. My father, Grant Carter, was a managing partner at one of the oldest private banking firms in the South. He ran our family the same way he ran portfolios, coldly, efficiently, and with no room for unpredictability. And to him, I was the most unpredictable investment of all. My mother, Vivian, was the embodiment of Southern decorum and social ambition. With a perfectly styled blonde bob and a closet full of navy cocktail dresses, she curated our lives the way others curated art. My brother, Thomas, and sister, Brielle, were her masterpieces. Thomas was the golden child, the Harvard-educated future of Carter legacy. He dressed like our father, talked like our father, and had an apartment in Charleston's financial district before he even turned 25. Brielle was the Southern belle incarnate, sugar and steel. She had my mother's charm and my father's ambition. By the time she turned 21, she was already engaged to a rising political star and finishing law school at Duke with a resume that belonged in a campaign ad. And then, there was me. The middle child. The question mark. The one who didn't quite fit into the Carter equation. While Thomas was mastering portfolio management and Brielle was making headlines in the society column, I was in my room taking apart computers and teaching myself code. I found more connection in algorithms than I ever did at the dinner table. At 13, I entered a robotics competition, won first place. They didn't come. At 16, I started a coding club at school and built a scheduling app for teachers that actually got adopted across the district. No one asked how it worked. At 18, I got accepted into Caltech on a partial scholarship. When I told them, my father said, "That's not a Carter school." My mother blinked. "How do you expect to meet a husband there?" I smiled and packed anyway, because something inside me knew I wasn't meant to follow their path. I was born to build my own. The summer before I left for Caltech, my parents handed me a printed itinerary. "Your college path," my mother said, like it was already etched in stone. Vanderbilt, then Georgetown, then a respectable job with a respectable man, the kind who wore cufflinks to brunch. I nodded, folded the paper, and later that night submitted my Caltech enrollment form. They could have paid for my tuition 10 times over. But they didn't. My father called it character building. My mother said it would keep me humble. Thomas got a condo and a BMW when he started grad school. Brielle had a monthly allowance bigger than my entire yearly income. Me? I worked 3 campus jobs, lived off coffee and scrambled eggs, and studied like my life depended on it. Because it did. They visited once, on their way to Napa, stayed for 15 minutes, took a photo outside a palm tree, and posted it with the caption, "Proud parents visiting our brilliant girl." Brilliant. A word they used for Instagram, not in conversation. But I didn't need their applause anymore. Not really. At graduation, I sat alone. Most of my friends had family cheering, crying, hugging. I had a silent phone and a crumpled program. Aunt Lorraine sent me a voice message that day. Just 8 words. "They may not see you. I do. Keep going." So I did. I moved to Austin, took a position at a small healthcare tech startup, and dove into the kind of work that made me feel like I was part of something real, something that could help people. It wasn't glamorous. I wasn't making 6 figures. But I was learning everything. Back-end systems, patient data flows, scheduling logic, security frameworks. Meanwhile, at Carter family dinners, I became a punchline. Still working with those hospital computers? "You're doing God's work, Elena," Brielle would smirk, lifting her wine glass like it was a communion offering. I laughed with them, smiled on cue, let them believe I was still figuring things out. But the truth? I was already laying the foundation for something they couldn't imagine, something that, when the time came, wouldn't just speak for itself. It would speak for every daughter they ever underestimated. At 23, I stopped checking my phone for congratulations after family gatherings. I already knew what wouldn't be there. No follow-up questions, no great job texts. Just silence that said everything they never would. Back in Austin, my days were full of urgency, late-night debugging, and conversations with hospital administrators who saw potential in what we were building. But the moment I returned home to Charleston, I stepped into a version of myself that felt stuck in time, small, muted, and politely ignored. The last Christmas I spent at the Carter estate, Thomas handed out branded mugs from his finance firm like they were heirlooms. My mother beamed with every sip. Brielle announced she was planning a mini wedding weekend. 3 days, 5 events, 7 dress changes. The room practically erupted with praise. When I mentioned I'd led a systems overhaul for a network of clinics in West Texas, cutting patient intake times by 60%, my father raised an eyebrow. "Still working those long hours, huh?" he said. "You'll burn out at that little startup if you're not careful." Little startup. He said it like it was cute, like it would fade away with time, like I would. I smiled because it was easier than arguing, but inside, something hardened. That night, I found myself standing alone on the back porch, holding a glass of lukewarm wine, staring at the same oak tree I used to climb as a kid. I remembered once falling from it when I was 7, scraping up both knees. My father handed me a bandage and said, "Next time, don't fall." That had been his version of parenting ever since. I'd spent so long believing that if I just worked harder, proved myself more, they'd eventually look up from their champagne glasses and notice what I'd built. But recognition was always reserved for Thomas's raises or Brielle's designer gowns. What I created didn't count, because they didn't understand it. And if they didn't understand it, it didn't matter. The truth settled in that winter, slow but steady. They weren't going to see me. So I stopped trying to be visible in their world and started pouring everything I had into building one of my own. It was around that time I began keeping secrets, not out of spite, but for self-preservation. I stopped explaining my work, stopped offering updates, stopped trying to translate the language of innovation into the dialect of old money and proper appearances. Let them think I was still figuring it out. Let them dismiss my career as temporary, because the longer they underestimated me, the more freedom I had to surprise them. And that surprise, it was coming sooner than they thought. By my 2nd year in Austin, I had stopped trying to translate my work into something my family would understand. I no longer mentioned hospital systems or predictive algorithms during phone calls, if they even called. Instead, I turned inward. I worked. I observed. I absorbed. It was during one of those 3 a.m. stretches, half asleep, half wired on caffeine, when I noticed something that kept repeating across the patient dashboards we were analyzing. Long wait times. Not just hours, weeks, even months. One particular case stuck with me, a woman in rural Texas, recently diagnosed with a neurological condition. She needed a specialist. Her primary doctor submitted the referral. And then, nothing. 3 months passed before she was seen. By then, her condition had progressed, irreversibly. That night, I couldn't sleep. The system wasn't broken. It was outdated. Specialists had gaps in their schedules, patients had urgent needs, but there was no intelligent way to match them. And somewhere in that frustration, the idea for VitalBridge Health was born. A centralized, HIPAA-compliant platform that could securely connect patients to available specialists in real time, prioritized by urgency, availability, and medical history. It would use AI to flag high-risk cases and route them more efficiently. Video consultations, prescription management, document sharing, all in one ecosystem. I knew I wasn't the first person to imagine better access to care, but I was determined to be the one who finally did something about it. I started sketching it out on sticky notes, then whiteboards, then diagrams. I'd stay at the office long after everyone had gone home, coding with music blasting through my headphones and fluorescent lights humming overhead. I ran tests, failed, iterated, rebuilt. There were nights I fell asleep with my laptop open, half a protein bar in my hand, alarms set for meetings I didn't even remember scheduling. I didn't tell anyone. Because I wasn't building it to impress my parents. I wasn't chasing a headline or a bonus. I was chasing that woman, the one who waited too long, the one whose condition worsened because no one thought to ask if there was a better way. And maybe, deep down, I was also chasing the version of me that used to believe someone else had to give me permission to matter. I still remember the exact moment I registered the business. I sat in my studio apartment, feet curled under a blanket, hand hovering over the submit button. My palms were sweaty. My heart was racing. For a split second, I thought about calling home. just to share it. Then I didn't, because this time, it didn't belong to them. This time, it belonged to me. Starting VitalBridge Health wasn't a leap. It was a slow, grinding climb, one sleepless night at a time. I didn't have a co-founder, no fancy pitch deck, no seed money from friends or family, just a dream scrawled across too many napkins and a dwindling savings account that I guarded like oxygen. I pulled $52,000 from my account, every last cent I had saved working at the startup, tutoring, and living off boxed mac and cheese in a shoebox apartment off South Lamar. Rent in Austin wasn't forgiving, and neither were student loans. But I wasn't interested in safety. I was interested in building something that mattered. By day, I still worked full-time. I showed up, delivered, smiled in meetings. But by night, I disappeared into code. I'd walk in my apartment, drop my bag, and within minutes I was deep in diagrams, frameworks, or database structure. It was lonely, brutal, beautiful. I couldn't afford an office, so I converted a tiny corner of my living room into a war zone of whiteboards, coffee mugs, and sticky notes. My desk was a folding table from Craigslist. My chair squeaked every time I leaned back. The air conditioning broke during a July heat wave, so I worked in tank tops and stuck frozen peas to my neck just to keep from overheating. I bought a second-hand standing desk for $40. It wobbled. I kept it anyway. 6 months in, I had a prototype. It was crude, but it worked. I could simulate the matching engine. I could run patient queries. It wasn't elegant, but it had bones. And more importantly, it had heart. What I didn't have was rest. I lived in cycles of over-caffeinated sprints and emotionally numb weekends. I didn't go on dates. I skipped brunches, missed birthdays. I declined every Carter family gathering with vague excuses. Crunch time, last-minute deployment, client issue. I couldn't tell them what I was building because they would only ask one question. But how does that make money? They never asked what problem I was solving or who it might help. I didn't need their questions. I needed allies. And that's when I met her. Her name was Maya Torres, and she showed up for what was supposed to be a one-time admin gig, answering emails, coordinating scheduling, keeping the chaos marginally organized. But by the end of her first week, she was catching logic bugs in the prototype and making suggestions on user flows. "Why are you doing this alone?" she asked me one night, after we'd worked until nearly midnight fixing a routing error in the triage system. I shrugged. "Because no one else believes in it." She looked me straight in the eye and said, "I do." That was the moment everything shifted. Maya didn't just become my second set of eyes. She became my anchor, my operator, my brain when mine was running on fumes. She had a background in healthcare administration and had seen the system fail real people in real time. She got it. And more than that, she got me. We didn't have titles, just hustle. We took turns on the floor when there weren't enough chairs, shared power outlets and ramen, laughed when the Wi-Fi went down, cried when we lost our first beta tester to a system crash, then rebuilt everything from scratch. It wasn't just about code anymore. It was about survival. And somehow, in all that chaos and sacrifice and sleeplessness, we were building more than a company. We were building a reason to keep going. By the time we had a functioning demo of VitalBridge Health, I thought we were finally ready to take the next step. Funding, validation, maybe even legitimacy. But what came next was something I hadn't anticipated. Rejection, over and over again, dressed up in politeness. I pitched to 37 investors, and with each meeting I learned how deep the bias ran. They nodded thoughtfully, praised the mission, complimented the interface. Then came the familiar tilt of the head and the dreaded question, "Do you have a technical co-founder?" Code for, "Where's the guy in the hoodie we're used to seeing?" It didn't matter that I had built the back end myself, that I'd been working in healthcare tech for 5 years, that we had working prototypes and strong user data. One investor actually said, "You're clearly smart, but healthcare's complicated. Maybe let someone more seasoned run the company and you can be CTO." Someone more seasoned. Translation, someone male, someone safe. Another asked if I had family wealth I could lean on until we got traction. I almost laughed. If he knew how many family dinners I'd left early just to make rent, he would have choked on his espresso. Maya kept telling me we'd find the right one. It only takes one yes, she'd remind me. We're not looking for dozens, just one person who sees it. But after the 20th rejection, even my optimism began to fracture. I started questioning everything. Was the vision too ambitious? Was I too unrelatable? Too young? Too female? Too something? We started skipping meals, skipped sleep too. We refined the pitch deck, rebranded the interface, practiced answers for every conceivable question, except the ones that weren't actually about the business, the ones that were really about us. There was one meeting I'll never forget, a VC in Houston, mid-50s, silk tie, no smile. After 30 minutes of presentation, he leaned back and said, "What makes you think people like you can lead in a space this big?" Not what makes your product special, not how will you scale, just why you? I don't remember what I said. I think I mumbled something about traction and medical need, but what I really wanted to say was, because people like me don't quit, because I've been overlooked my whole life and I still show up, because I know what it's like to build something in silence and make it sing. That night, Maya and I sat on the floor of our tiny co-working space, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-erased whiteboards. I looked at her, completely exhausted, and whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not what they're looking for." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder. Inside were printouts, hospital efficiency data, patient testimonials from our beta test, feedback from nurses who'd used the system during trials. Real people, real results. "This is what they aren't looking at," she said. "But it's exactly why we're not stopping." A few weeks later, our 38th meeting was with a former healthcare executive turned angel investor named Jessica Barnes. She listened. Really listened. She asked about the tech, the impact, the rollout timeline. But not once did she question if we belonged. At the end of the meeting, she leaned forward and said, "You don't need fixing. You need fuel." Then she wrote us a check for $200,000. Just like that, we could breathe again. And more than that, we could finally begin. Jessica Barnes's check didn't just pay the bills. It lit the fuse. For the first time since we'd launched the idea, Maya and I didn't have to calculate whether we could afford gas or groceries. We rented a tiny corner office in East Austin, once a supply closet in a co-working building that still smelled faintly of drywall dust and old printer ink. We bought secondhand monitors, used folding chairs. One desk came with a broken drawer we duct-taped shut for 6 months, but none of that mattered, because we had space. We had air, and we had our first 3 hires. A back-end developer named John, who used to build inventory platforms for food banks, a UX designer named Priya, who'd worked on Medicaid enrollment tools in rural areas, and Maya, now officially our operations lead, though we still couldn't afford real titles or proper salaries. We worked 7 days a week, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. We had something to prove. Not to investors, not to competitors, but to every nurse who stayed late to process paperwork, to every elderly patient who waited months to get an answer, to every doctor forced to cancel consults because the system failed them. That was our fuel. The first few months were brutal. The software broke often. The scheduling logic ran into endless bugs. One week we lost all our test data because someone forgot to back up the staging server. That someone was me. We cried, we screamed, we ate terrible takeout on the floor at 11 p.m. more nights than I can count. We coded through thunderstorms, literal and emotional. We took turns napping on a yoga mat behind the filing cabinet when exhaustion won out. But slowly, painfully, something began to work. Our triage tool started routing patients faster. Our matching algorithm could predict cancellations and reroute them in real time. Maya built onboarding modules for clinic administrators. John automated the referral upload process. Priya redesigned the UI so it no longer looked like it was built during a caffeine hallucination. 9 months in, we got the email that changed everything. Central Texas Medical Group, a regional hospital network based out of San Marcos, wanted to pilot VitalBridge Health in their neurology department. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I reread the message. Then I sat down and stared at it for 10 minutes with my mouth open before quietly saying, "Maya." She spun around in her chair. "What?" I turned the screen toward her. Her face lit up in slow motion. "Oh my God." We went in person the following week. I wore a blazer that didn't quite fit and heels that gave me blisters. Maya brought handouts with printed FAQs and laminated testimonials. We met with physicians, data officers, department heads. It was terrifying and completely exhilarating. They agreed to a 90-day pilot. 1 department, limited scope, minimal risk. But to us, it felt like a green light from the universe. By the end of the first month, wait times in that department dropped by 41%. Specialist schedules were more evenly filled. Patient satisfaction scores jumped. We finally had something that couldn't be dismissed. Data. Real results. Proof that our vision was more than theory. It was impact. We sat in that dusty little office one night, Maya passing me a cheap bottle of champagne she'd bought with her first paycheck. "To not giving up," she said. I clinked her glass with mine and whispered, "To being seen." Because for the first time it felt like we finally were. The pilot with Central Texas Medical changed everything. Other hospitals started calling, first smaller clinics in Waco and Temple, then a larger network out of Dallas. We didn't even have a proper sales team, but word was spreading. And for the first time, our inbox was filled with questions that started with how much instead of why you. Our revenue was still modest, but we were growing. Enough to finally leave the supply closet and move into a real office in South Congress, one with glass walls and natural light and chairs that didn't creak when you leaned back. We hired 10 more people in 3 months. Maya became our COO in everything but title. John led engineering. Priya oversaw design. The work was hard, exhausting, sometimes chaotic, but it was working. We had proof. We had purpose. But I still hadn't told my family a word. At Carter family dinners, I was still just doing tech stuff in Austin. Still the one who arrived quietly, sat at the edge of the conversation, and left before dessert. It wasn't out of spite. It was protection. Because I knew how the conversation would go. They wouldn't ask about how the platform helped stroke patients reach neurologists within 24 hours. They'd ask how much we were making. They wouldn't care that we'd reduced emergency department overload by 30% in one trial. They'd ask why I hadn't moved back to Charleston. They wouldn't hear success. They'd hear disruption. And disruption in the Carter household was code for embarrassment, so I kept it all hidden. Even when Forbes listed VitalBridge Health on their Startups to Watch list, I didn't forward the link. When we crossed $1 million in annual revenue, I didn't text a soul. When we opened a second office in Dallas, I told them I'd just been traveling a bit more for work. The irony was that we were being seen by everyone, except the people who had never really looked at me. Sometimes I'd drive back from a hospital meeting or an investor pitch, exhausted and exhilarated, and catch myself wondering what it would be like if they were proud of me. Just once. If my father said, "That's impressive, Elena." If my mother looked at me the way she looked at Brielle in her campaign headshots. If Thomas asked a single genuine question without condescension. But that world didn't exist. And I had made peace with that. Mostly. There were still moments. At night. In the quiet. When the inbox went still and the city lights flickered outside my window. I'd feel that ache. That buried instinct to call someone who had no interest in what I was building. That's when I'd remember what Maya said during one of our toughest months. You don't need everyone to believe in it, just the right ones. So I surrounded myself with those people, the right ones, people who didn't need the Carter name to see my worth, people who understood that the most radical thing you can do sometimes is keep going even when no one's watching. And soon, very soon, they would be watching. whether they were ready or not. The momentum didn't stop. After the Central Texas pilot, hospital after hospital began reaching out. Word spread through medical conferences, referrals, even LinkedIn. Some wanted demos, others signed on sight unseen, desperate for a system that worked better than what they'd been using since 2005. We moved into a larger office downtown, overlooking Lady Bird Lake. The windows didn't face the skyline, but I didn't care. For the first time, we had a view of something that felt like a future. By the end of the year, we had 15 employees. The platform had been deployed across 43 clinics in 3 states. Patient wait times were down 68% on average. We'd reduced provider burnout, improved scheduling efficiency, and added multilingual interfaces for underrepresented communities. It was working. We had real revenue, real data, real impact, and yet I still hadn't told my family. Not when I got interviewed by a regional healthcare magazine. Not when our first 7-figure contract came in. Not even when VitalBridge Health was named one of the top 10 most promising startups in Texas. At this point, it wasn't just protection anymore. It was strategy. I was waiting for the right moment, the right room, the right tone. I didn't want to tell them in a rushed phone call or a dismissive brunch while Brielle passed around monogrammed save the dates. I wanted to do it when I could control the space, the narrative, the power. That moment arrived when Morgan Vale, a major investment bank, ironically the same firm where my father had once held a senior partner title, reached out. They'd heard about our work. One of their partners had a family member who had used VitalBridge during a post-surgical follow-up. They were impressed. They wanted in. What started as a casual exploratory call turned into multiple formal meetings. Our Series B closed fast, $28 million at a $65 million valuation. Morgan Vale wanted to lead our IPO. When I saw the proposal in writing, I stared at the logo at the top of the PDF for a long time. My father had once told me that people like us don't work in healthcare, we manage people who do. Now, his former employer was putting my company on the front of their healthcare innovation prospectus. It was poetic. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because the Carter family dinner was coming, the annual winter gathering where Thomas would casually mention bonuses the size of mortgages, and Brielle would flash her fiancé's political connections like pearls. And I had decided that night would be the reveal. Not because I needed their recognition, but because I was done hiding. I didn't want their approval. I just wanted to stop pretending I hadn't already built what they said I never could. The irony? They were planning to cut me off that night. They had no idea what was coming. The Carter winter dinner was always hosted at the Charleston estate. White pillars, warm lighting, the smell of pine and roasted duck filling the air. And always a performance. My mother would arrange every floral centerpiece like it was a political campaign. Thomas would arrive last, as if we'd all been waiting for his cue to begin. But this year, I walked in differently. Maya had flown out with me under the guise of a friend from Austin. She stayed at a nearby hotel, just in case. I needed someone in my corner, even silently. I wore a simple navy dress. No designer label, no statement jewelry. I didn't want them to mistake me for someone trying to impress them. I wasn't. I was there to end something. Vivian greeted me with a stiff hug and a comment about how pale I looked. Brielle gave a distracted wave. Thomas barely looked up from his phone. "Nice of you to make it this year," my father said, as if this gathering were an act of charity and I'd been a negligent guest. I smiled. Wouldn't miss it. Dinner was served in courses: duck confit, roasted beet salad, truffle risotto. I barely tasted any of it. I was watching them, listening. They moved in rehearsed rhythm. Thomas dominating every conversation with finance jargon, Brielle turning every anecdote into a campaign story, and my mother interrupting with shallow praise that masked barbed undertones. Then the conversation shifted. Grant cleared his throat and looked down the table at me. "Elena," he began, "your mother and I have been talking. You've been distant, and we think it's time you made some decisions." I set my fork down. Decisions? Yes, Vivian chimed in. about your future, about being part of this family in a more productive way. Thomas chuckled. Dad means you've had your little independence phase. Time to come home. Do something real. It was like watching them step into a trap they didn't know I'd built years ago. Vivian leaned in. There's an opportunity, a managing role in Thomas's new fund. You'd work under him, of course, but it's a start. Brielle added, and we'd help you with rent again. Charleston's not cheap. Help me with rent. I breathed out slowly. Thank you for the offer. Grant gave a satisfied nod, as if he'd just saved me from drowning. And then I pulled out the envelope. It wasn't fancy, just white cardstock. I slid it across the table, face down. What's this? He asked. Our Series B announcement, I said. VitalBridge just closed at $65 million. Morgan Vale led the round. They're also preparing our IPO. Silence. Utter silence. I looked at Thomas first. He went pale. Then Brielle, whose jaw twitched. Vivian was the one to speak. What is VitalBridge? I turned to her. The company I started. The one I've been running for the past 4 years. The one you said was a waste of time. Grant's hands clenched around the paper. You mean you've been lying? No, I said calmly. I've just stopped asking you to see me. I stood slowly. Dinner was lovely, but I have a board meeting in the morning. And just like that, I walked out. Not from dinner, from their version of me. I didn't cry in the car, not when Maya met me on the sidewalk with her quiet, steady presence, not when we got back to the hotel and she handed me a glass of water, not even when I kicked off my heels and let the silence settle like a second skin. The tears didn't come. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because for the first time I felt something stronger than pain. I felt free. For years I had tiptoed around their expectations, shrunk myself to fit in the corners they allowed me, let them believe they were the sun and I was just orbiting around them, grateful for scraps of warmth. But now the truth was on the table, cold and undeniable. They couldn't unhear what I said, couldn't unknow what I'd built, couldn't erase my name from that funding document or my company from the healthcare systems improving lives across 5 states. They could no longer dismiss me with polite condescension, but what haunted me wasn't their silence at the table. It was what might come next. 2 days later, my phone started buzzing. First, it was Thomas. A brief text. Is this some kind of PR stunt? Then Vivian. Why wouldn't you tell us sooner? And finally, my father. We should talk. There are opportunities to coordinate your platform with Carter Group partners. I assume you'll need support scaling. I stared at that one for a long time. Support. After years of being called unrealistic, naive, and a waste of potential, now they wanted in. Now that the papers were public and the money was real, suddenly I wasn't a disappointment. I was a resource. I didn't reply. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. They weren't reaching out to repair anything. They weren't reflecting or apologizing. They were strategizing, positioning, treating me like an asset they forgot they owned. But I wasn't theirs anymore. That night, Maya and I walked by the lake in downtown Austin. It was cold, quiet, and the sky looked heavy, like it might snow, though it rarely did. She looked over at me and asked softly, "How do you feel now?" I exhaled. Lighter. Not happier, but lighter. You're not done, she said. I know. The truth is, the hardest part wasn't standing up to them. The hardest part was living in the space after. The silence, the mental rewiring, the grief that creeps in when you realize your family may never choose to know the real you, only the version they built to control. But I also knew this: I had finally chosen myself. And that choice was the most powerful inheritance I'd ever claim. I didn't expect the backlash to come so fast. Within a week, the emails started. Not from investors, not from advisors, from Brielle. The subject line read, "Urgent family matter." The body, "We need to talk before you do any more damage. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Call me." Harder for who? She'd sat in that dining room while they offered me a job under Thomas, as if I hadn't built something from the ground up. She'd watched me pull out the funding announcement and still said nothing. No defense, no congratulations, just stunned silence and a glass of wine that never left her hand. Now I was the problem? I didn't reply. The next day, a package arrived at our Austin office. No note, just a thin manila envelope inside, marked confidential, and a familiar signature at the bottom of the cover page, Grant Carter. It was a proposal. A formal offer from Carter Group Holdings to merge resources with VitalBridge Health. Their legal language was slick. On the surface, it looked like a partnership. But buried in the fourth paragraph was a clause that would effectively hand controlling interest to the Carters. They were trying to buy me, not because they believed in the mission, not because they supported the tech, but because they couldn't stand the idea of my success existing without their fingerprints all over it. I closed the envelope and pushed it aside. I didn't even need to think about it. But what hurt most wasn't the offer. It was the assumption that I was still the girl desperate for approval, that I'd trade my independence for a sliver of conditional belonging, that I was still theirs to mold. I wasn't. And I proved it the next morning when I forwarded the offer to my legal team with one instruction: decline, formally, publicly if needed. A few hours later, Maya walked into my office with 2 coffees and raised a brow. "So, you ready for the storm?" I nodded. Let it come. Because something had shifted inside me. For so long, I thought I needed to prove my worth to them before I could walk away. That I had to show them something big enough, shiny enough, undeniable enough to earn peace. But now I knew. Peace doesn't come from convincing others you matter. It comes from no longer needing their agreement. And even as my inbox lit up again, this time with angry calls, guilt-laced texts, and empty invitations to talk things through, I stayed quiet, not passive, just done. I wasn't being cruel. I was being clear. And clarity, it turns out, is a language my family had never learned how to hear. After the decline letter was sent, the quiet that followed was deafening. No more emails, no more calls, no more texts from Brielle laced with passive-aggressive urgency, just a strange, echoing stillness. At first, I checked my phone out of habit, half expecting a voicemail, a sarcastic message from Thomas, or another thinly veiled bribe disguised as a business invitation. But each time the screen lit up, it wasn't them. It was the people who mattered now. Our operations director confirming the onboarding of 2 major hospital systems in Arizona, Maya reminding me to take lunch, a message from one of our developers, excited that VitalBridge had made a top 50 startups to watch list. The silence from my family, once terrifying, began to feel like a kind of protection, because what they couldn't give me in love, I had stopped begging for in validation. I'd spent so many years trying to translate myself into a language they'd respect. But no matter how fluent I became in their world, money, metrics, strategy, it was never about understanding. It was about control. And now, without access to mine, they had nothing to say. But my life, it was getting louder. We moved into a new headquarters, an old converted post office in East Austin. Exposed brick, tall ceilings, buzzing with the sound of ambition. There was even a rooftop patio where our small team would gather after launches, looking out over the city like we were part of something bigger than ourselves. And we were. Every new client, every press article, every time a patient portal translated complicated medical jargon into clear, accessible care, it was working. VitalBridge wasn't just a company anymore. It was a movement, and I was no longer building it from behind closed doors. I was leading it, loudly, clearly, and without apology. One night, after a long day of back-to-back meetings, I stood alone on that rooftop, watching the sun dip behind the skyline. The air smelled like cedar and hot concrete, and for the first time in my adult life, I whispered something I'd never dared believe. I'm proud of me. Not because of the funding, not because of the headlines, but because I had chosen integrity over legacy, truth over tradition. I didn't need to be the daughter they paraded. I needed to be the woman I believed in, and that, more than anything, had become my legacy. The recognition came quietly at first. An industry blog featured VitalBridge in a roundup about female-led health tech startups. Then a few investors forwarded it to their networks. The next week, we were contacted by a major medical journal requesting an interview, one where they didn't just want the science. They wanted the story. My story. It felt strange to say yes. For so long, I'd hidden behind code and clinical data, letting the product speak for itself. But now, they were asking who made it. Why? What pain shaped the platform? I sat across from the journalist at a cafe on South Congress, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I barely drank. She asked gentle questions. I gave honest answers. And for the first time, I told the truth. Not the edited version, not the clean investor pitch, but the actual truth. About being dismissed. About the boardroom dinner where they called my ideas idealistic. About growing up in the Carter household, where approval was conditional and love was a currency they kept locked behind a gate I never had the key to. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from women across the country, engineers, founders, single moms, nurses, even a high school senior who said she'd bookmarked it as proof she didn't need her dad's permission to dream. But with every message that lit up my inbox, there was still a quiet ache beneath the pride. My father didn't reach out. Thomas didn't acknowledge the story, even as it circulated through their firm. Brielle sent a single text. I saw the article. You made your point. That was it. No apology, no congratulations, just the lingering bitterness of people who had once been gatekeepers, now finding the gates had been torn down without their blessing. Still, I didn't spiral. Because I wasn't doing this to prove something to them anymore. I was doing it for the girl I used to be. The one who sat outside boardrooms with a laptop balanced on her knees, dreaming of building something that mattered. And she was watching me now. She was proud. Later that week, our COO, Darnell, surprised me with a plaque for our office wall. 2025 Health Tech Founder of the Year, Elena Carter. I traced the engraved letters with my fingers, speechless, because it wasn't just an award. It was a reminder that my story didn't have to be rewritten to be worthy. It just had to be told. The last person I expected to see at the conference was Brielle. It was the final morning of the National Health Tech Summit in Denver. I had just finished speaking on a panel about equitable data practices and was weaving through a crowd of executives, shaking hands, when I saw her. Standing near the back wall, arms crossed, lips pressed in that familiar half-scowl of disapproval. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. I nodded politely and started to walk away, but she stepped in front of me. Elena, she said, her tone clipped. You've been ignoring your family. I kept my voice steady. I haven't. I've been protecting my peace. She scoffed. By humiliating Dad? By going public with whatever that was? She gestured vaguely, probably referring to the article, the keynote, the surge of visibility she didn't control. I told my story, I said, eyes level. And if that felt humiliating, maybe it says more about what was done than what was said. Her jaw tensed. You think you're above us now, just because you've got some funding and a PR team? No, I replied, calm but firm. I think I'm no longer beneath you. That stopped her. For years, I had begged for scraps of acknowledgement, proof that I was enough. But now, standing under fluorescent lights in a convention center filled with people who respected me not for my last name but for my work, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt grounded. I didn't come here to fight, she said after a pause, her voice lower. Dad's retiring. Thomas is stepping up. You should know. I nodded. Thanks for letting me know. She lingered, as if expecting me to say more, maybe even ask for a seat at the table again. But I didn't, because I had built my own. Later, I returned to my hotel suite, the city lights twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat down and opened my laptop, pulling up the draft of a new project proposal, a pediatric care initiative we were launching in underserved communities. And as I typed, I felt the tension in my body slowly dissolve. Brielle's appearance had stirred the past, yes, but it had also reminded me just how far I'd come. I no longer needed her approval, or my father's, because the person I had fought the hardest to convince was finally on my side. Me. Weeks passed after the conference, but Brielle's visit lingered like the last echo in a quiet room. Not haunting, just unresolved. I wasn't expecting closure, but there was still a sliver of me that had hoped for something different. A gesture, a softening, even just an honest sentence. It never came, and that in itself became the answer I didn't want, but finally accepted. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the old Carter estate in Brookline. Not to visit, just to see it one last time before the property changed hands. Dad was officially stepping down, and Thomas had moved in with his wife. The gate still creaked the same way it used to when I was 17, sneaking out to coding workshops instead of debutante dinners. The garden out front looked smaller, the hedges overgrown and tired. The brass plaque with our last name had dulled. I sat in my car for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, watching as raindrops trailed slowly down the windshield. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt ready. Ready to leave behind the version of me that once stood on that doorstep, desperate for permission to matter. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't need to. I whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "I release you." And I meant it. On the way home, I took the long route, past the coffee shop where I used to write grant proposals at 2 a.m., past the university library where I borrowed whiteboard markers to sketch out the earliest wireframes of what would become VitalBridge. Each place held a memory of rejection, but also of resistance, of building something when no one clapped, of choosing to believe in myself when silence was the only feedback. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, barefoot on the balcony, city lights flickering in the distance, and I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not because everything had healed, but because I had. The past wasn't a wound anymore. It was scaffolding, necessary for the structure, but no longer visible in the architecture. And as I looked toward the next chapter of my life, I didn't feel haunted by what could have been. I felt free. About a month after my visit to the Carter estate, I attended a fundraising gala for the Pediatric Equity Initiative, one of the few events I genuinely looked forward to. No pretense, no power games, just purpose. It was held at a historic venue in downtown Boston, all warm chandeliers and soft jazz echoing across the marble floors. I arrived in a navy jumpsuit, heels low, hair pinned back, polished but not performative. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was dressing to prove anything, just showing up as myself. I had just finished speaking with a group of young nonprofit founders when I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Elena Carter," a voice said behind me, amused. "Still finding ways to outshine the room." I turned and laughed. Genuinely. It was Jacob Reyes. We hadn't spoken since grad school. Back then, he was the quiet type, deep thinker, always buried in ethics textbooks, while the rest of us scrambled to build pitch decks. I remembered how he once stayed up an entire night helping me test a prototype, only to disappear into a fellowship in Geneva the next week. "I thought you moved to Switzerland permanently," I said, smiling. "I did. Then I realized I liked it better where the problems are personal," he replied, shrugging. "I'm back for good, leading health access strategy at Everon." We fell into easy conversation. Not forced networking, not agenda-driven small talk, just two people reconnecting with shared values and the kind of history that doesn't demand explanation. Eventually, we stepped onto the outdoor terrace, away from the crowd. "I read your piece in the Atlantic," he said softly. "Your story, it stayed with me. Especially the part where you said, 'I built the bridge no one offered me.' That line. I almost forgot I wrote it. But hearing it back, in his voice, felt different, felt seen. You know," he added, "sometimes the people who push us away are the ones who sense how far we're going to climb, and it scares them." I didn't respond right away. The words settled like warmth in my chest. Then I said quietly, "I stopped looking for their applause." "And maybe," he said, turning toward me, "you're finally surrounded by people who wouldn't dare make you earn it." There was a stillness between us. Not romantic, not yet, but charged with something tender, something safe. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guarded. I just felt open. And as the night wrapped up and we exchanged numbers, I wasn't planning 10 steps ahead or analyzing subtext. I was just curious, hopeful. Maybe healing doesn't always look like walking away. Sometimes it looks like walking toward something new, without fear. Jacob and I began meeting regularly, casual dinners after work, walks by the Charles River on Sunday afternoons. Our conversations spanned effortlessly from healthcare ethics to favorite music, always ending in comfortable silences rather than awkward goodbyes. I had almost forgotten how good it felt to simply be heard, to be seen, without having to first prove I was worth seeing. One crisp evening in late autumn, we walked along Commonwealth Avenue under the warm glow of street lamps. Leaves crunched softly beneath our feet, and I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck as we moved closer together, shoulders brushing occasionally. "You know," Jacob started, glancing down with a shy smile, "it's funny. I always thought you'd end up running some Fortune 500 company, but seeing you now, I get it." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "You get what?" "Why you chose this path," he said, meeting my gaze. "Building something real. Something yours. You're not chasing success anymore. You're embodying it." His words settled gently in my chest, comforting and validating at once. "It took me a long time to realize," I admitted quietly, "that I could define success differently than my family did." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding written plainly in his eyes. "I get that more than you know. My parents wanted me to be a surgeon, prestigious, respectable. Instead, I found myself in policy rooms, advocating for people I'd never met, and knowing it was exactly where I belonged." I smiled softly. "Funny how much strength it takes to choose yourself over everyone else's dreams." "Especially," he added gently, "when their approval feels tied to their love." The air between us stilled. He'd said out loud the quiet truth I'd been carrying for years, the unspoken weight I was finally setting down. I paused beneath a maple tree, looking up as the leaves fell gently around us. I spent most of my life thinking love was transactional, that I had to earn it, pay for it somehow, with achievement or obedience or silence. Jacob stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. "And now?" "And now," I breathed out, my voice catching just slightly, "I'm learning that love isn't something I should ever have to bargain for." Without a word, Jacob reached out, softly taking my hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a gentle rush through me, not anxious or desperate, but calm, certain. I let my fingers intertwine with his, feeling grounded for the first time in so long. I wasn't planning a future yet. I wasn't labeling this moment as anything more than what it was: beautiful, honest, real. But as we stood there together beneath the soft Boston twilight, something shifted inside me. A quiet, steady hope bloomed. Maybe love didn't have to be complicated. Maybe, just maybe, it could be as simple as two people finally finding home in each other. Jacob and I continued seeing each other steadily through winter and into the early blooms of spring. Every moment we spent together was a quiet revelation. easy, gentle, comforting in ways I hadn't expected or dared hope for. One afternoon, I invited him to our offices in East Austin. I felt oddly nervous, even though he knew everything already: the story, the struggles, the triumphs. Still, I found myself smoothing invisible wrinkles from my blouse, fussing with my hair in the reflection of my laptop screen. He arrived precisely on time, bearing 2 coffees and that soft, familiar smile. I showed him around, feeling unexpectedly proud as I introduced him to Maya, Priya, and the rest of our team, the people who had believed in me when no one else had. When we reached my office, sunlight streamed warmly through the windows, catching on the polished glass plaque we'd recently hung: VitalBridge Health, etched alongside the list of hospitals and clinics we'd partnered with across the country. Jacob stood quietly, studying it, then turned to me. "You've created something extraordinary, Elena," he said softly. "And not just the technology. You've built a place where people feel valued, safe, seen." I met his eyes, my chest tightening with quiet emotion. "Because I know exactly how it feels when you're not." He stepped closer, his gaze gentle but unwavering. "You took pain and turned it into purpose. That's no small thing." I swallowed, blinking back the warmth behind my eyes. For a long time, I thought my story was about proving something to the Carters, about earning my place. "And now?" he asked gently. "Now," I whispered, voice steadying with a certainty I'd earned, "it's about living authentically. It's about choosing compassion, even when I wasn't shown it myself." His eyes softened. "You're not just rewriting your story, Elena. You're helping other people rewrite theirs, too." Without another word, he stepped forward and pulled me gently into his arms. It wasn't dramatic or sweeping, just a quiet embrace, steady and warm, the kind that made everything around us feel softer, safer. I rested my head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "You know," he murmured softly, "it's okay to let yourself be proud. You've earned it." A gentle laugh escaped me, tinged with relief. "I'm learning." And as we stood there, bathed in afternoon light, I realized something profound, something that years of striving hadn't fully taught me until now. Success wasn't headlines or accolades or even funding rounds. It was the peace I felt standing right here, in the quiet after all the storms, finally letting myself be loved. Not for what I'd built, but simply for who I'd become. Standing on stage in the Austin Women in Tech Summit, looking out at the bright eyes of 1,000 hopeful faces, I felt my journey crystallize in a single quiet breath. My name is Elena Carter, and for so long, I thought life was about proving my worth, earning love through accomplishments, applause, or family approval. But the truth is simpler, softer, and infinitely stronger. We don't need to earn our place in this world. It belongs to us from the moment we claim it. As I looked out across that audience, I saw versions of myself: the dreamers, the fighters, those still searching for permission to believe in themselves. If I could offer you, one truth from everything I've lived, it would be this: you don't need anyone's permission to become who you're meant to be. I spent years chasing validation from people who couldn't see my worth. I thought success meant finally convincing them I belonged, but real success never needed their blessing. It was about learning to listen to the quiet, steady voice inside myself that whispered, "Keep going. You matter. You are enough." Family doesn't always mean understanding. Love doesn't always look like approval. And sometimes, our greatest act of courage is simply letting go. Of expectations, of old wounds, of the stories that no longer fit. Today, VitalBridge Health helps thousands of people find care they desperately need. But the bridge I'm proudest of building isn't made of code or data. It's made of compassion, of resilience, of choosing to rewrite my story, not from pain, but from possibility. Jacob stood in the back of the room, a gentle smile on his face. Maya sat in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else. These were the people who taught me that family isn't limited to blood. It's built from kindness, support, and the courage to see one another clearly. As the applause filled the room, I felt something powerful inside my chest, a quiet strength born not from the applause itself, but from the journey it took to stand here authentically. So, to you listening right now, trust your voice, even if it trembles. Follow your path, even if it scares you. And never apologize for claiming your own worth, your own dreams, your own heart. Because your story matters, your voice matters, and you deserve every good thing waiting on the other side of fear. If my journey has resonated with you, if you've ever struggled to define success on your own terms, please take a moment to subscribe, like, comment, and share this story. Your courage might just inspire someone else to begin rewriting their own.